Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm a librarian at the Saratoga Springs Public Library. And I want to let you know, if you have questions this evening, there's a chat button at the bottom of your screen if you're on a laptop or desktop, or if you're on a tablet. If you tap the screen, you should be able to find a more menu that would have the chat function. And you can put your questions in chat at any time that you want, and we'll read them aloud at the end. We at the library were really delighted to be co-hosting this Adirondack Mountain Club program, Alaska, the Last Frontier, with Peter Benoit. I've seen the slides. You're in for a treat tonight. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ann Polano, who's the program chair for the Adirondack Mountain Club, and she's going to be introducing our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ann Polano, and welcome to the Glens Falls Saratoga chapter of the Adirondack Mountain Club's April program. For those of you unfamiliar, the Adirondack Mountain Club is dedicated to preserving New York's wild lands, providing outdoor education and promoting responsible recreation. Information on our outings, programs, and membership is available on our website, adk-gfs.org. I have a few quick announcements. Many of you will know our chapter is currently hosting the Banff Mountain Film Festival virtually. If you purchase tickets to view these incredible movies via a link on our website, we receive a small portion of sales. Additionally, this month features a movie entitled The River and the Wall. It's a 2019 award-winning documentary examining the impact of the border wall on the environment, and features chapter member Heather Mackey, daughter of Steve and Leisha Mackey. This movie sold out 2 nights at the Wood Theatre, so this is a great chance to see it again. There will be a spring cleanup on Saturday, May 15th at 9 a.m. to approximately 2 p.m. at ADK headquarters in Lake George, and anyone who wants to come and help would be very welcome. Our next program is on Wednesday, May 19th, still remotely via Zoom in conjunction with Saratoga Library. Steve Engelhardt, Architectural Heritage Arch, will present a program entitled Historic Bridges of the Adirondacks. And you can sign up via links on the Saratoga Library or the adkgfs.org website. And lastly, I'd like to thank Chris Alexander, reference librarian, for her assistance in coordinating the tech involved in holding this program. She's very knowledgeable and extremely helpful. So now to our program. Peter Benoit is a nature photographer based in Queensbury, New York. His photographs frequently celebrate life within the Adirondacks Blue Line, along with other regions of North America and Europe. He traveled to Alaska in 2016 and 2018, and we're delighted to have him here tonight to share his fascinating photographs. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to the Glens Falls chapter for the invitation to present tonight. And another thank you to Chris Alexander for helping me with the logistics of the program, but specifically with maps that she helped annotate for me, which you'll see in a few moments. So welcome all. Thank you for logging in tonight for this presentation on Alaska, the Last Frontier. And the Last Frontier is a nickname for Alaska, and it is marketed statewide. If you've ever been to Alaska, you've seen it virtually everywhere. My trip in 2016 involved a couple of boat rides and a plane ride over Denali, and my 2018 trip involved a helicopter ride to photograph grizzly bears, and we'll be talking all about that as we move forward. So just as a frame of reference, a map of Alaska here, and you can see Anchorage is annotated with a circle. If you look just above it, you'll see a route number 3, and below that is a turn to the right towards a town called Glen Allen. On that road there is Palmer, Alaska, which we'll be coming to in a few minutes, where the state fair has been held. And then as we move along the presentation, there'll be other maps to show us proximity of where we are in the state. It's the southern part of Alaska. This is the visitor center, the Welcome Center in downtown Anchorage. Anchorage has a population over 300,000, which is almost half of Alaska's residents, which is just over 700,000 people. So in the middle of the 10, 12, 15-story buildings in downtown Anchorage is this little cabin with grass on the roof and lots of flowers and whatnot. It's a terrific place to start your trip and get your footings once you arrive in the 59th state. Across the street is an office building which houses a National Park Service. When I was there in 2016, we actually got to celebrate the 100th birthday of the National Park Service with Smokey Bear and birthday cake, and that was kind of fun. So downtown Anchorage is an interesting place, and this really sets the tone for your visit in the state. These are some shots of the skyline of downtown Anchorage, and the Hilton Hotel there in the left-hand corner of the screen is one of the tallest. And you can see the Chugach Mountains in the background in the city. And here we're looking out to the harbor. And it's a major point of freight and railroad intermodal connection here. And the building that's below these trees, there's off to the right is a little bed and breakfast we stayed at called the Arctic Fox, which was a delightful place to stay. We stayed in bed and breakfast in both trips to make it more personal. And the hosts of the bed and breakfast were really helpful in giving us tourist information that we followed and enjoyed. This is a picture of downtown Anchorage from the other side of the harbor. And you're looking at a grassy meadow here on the shore of Cook Inlet. And this shot here, if you notice that bluff there to your left and then this grassy shore, there's approximately a 17-foot drop. And if you recall that in April of 1964, Alaska was hit with a massive earthquake. And this is an area of subsidence of 17 feet. And there were hundreds of homes along this edge of the harbor that were destroyed and people impacted by that earthquake. It was remarkable to stand there and look up and realize the earth simply just dropped into Cook Inlet. Also downtown is the headquarters of the Alaska Mount McKinley Express Railroad. It travels from Seward all the way up to Fairbanks, and we'll see the railroad tracks on a line a little farther along. But it's an extremely popular tourist attraction. You can take different segments of it from point A to point B, or you can take the entire trip from Seward all the way up to Fairbanks. And that's a long ride. I think when we drove from Fairbanks to Anchorage, it was 6 or 7 hours, and you don't necessarily do 55 miles an hour either, although the roads aren't terrific. Here we're looking at Alaska as a whole, and if you look at the center of the map, you can see where Fairbanks is below the White Mountains National Recreation Area, and then all the way south down to Seward, where it says Kenai National Forest in blue, and just above that you can see Seward. So that's basically the route of the railroad itself. And again, just north of Anchorage, where Route 1 pulls off to the right, we joined the Alaska State Fair. When I was a child, I probably was in grade school, maybe in elementary or in early high school. I read a copy of my dad's National Geographic magazine, and there was an article on the Alaska State Fair and photographs of people who grew vegetables. And I can just remember this image of a man holding either a beet or a radish that was the size of a basketball. And the image always stuck with me. And it's like, I have to go there someday and see these vegetables. You'll see them in a minute. So Alaska in the summertime has 17 and a half hours of sunlight. So the photosynthesis on the plants is nearly continuous. And therefore, with the rich soil in this valley, the plants are enormous in terms of their size. So Chugach Mountains are in the background here. And in these photographs of the fair, these probably are the Chinetna Mountains, and the ones with snow in another image will be the Chugach, which you saw in Anchorage. A typical fair, a state fair, it's small. I would say for us locally, the footprint's probably about 3 times the size of the Washington County Fair. It's not enormous, but then again, the state only has 700,000 people, and it's massive in terms of its square miles. There's agricultural buildings, there's specific outdoor exhibits like these topiaries and whatnot. lots of families, and every fair has something special in terms of its attraction for food. And this is Friar's Tuck, which was known for its roasted corn on the cob, and the lines were fairly long most of the time. So now we get into the agricultural displays, and I just found this fascinating because of the photosynthesis and the size of the plants and how large they grow. So here's an example of some of them. Here is a turnip that's nearly 19 pounds, the center blue ribbon. There's a kohlrabi that's 23 pounds. I mean, can you imagine growing one of these here? It's crazy. Here is rhubarb. The stalk of rhubarb with the blue ribbon, the single stalk is nearly 3 pounds. And that's just, it's nuts. And here's the state record for a cucumber, 20.20 pounds. It's just amazing. I mean, I just smiled and chuckled all through this building. Here's another head of cabbage that's 28 pounds. And here is a zucchini, which you think, is fairly massive at 13 pounds, but it has nothing on this. Look at that ribbon and what it says, 62.4 pounds. That's half my body weight, that zucchini. It would take 2 people to lift that onto its little display case. That just blew me away. Home preservation is a huge occupation and hobby, avocation in Alaska because there's so many homesteaders there. And one of the things that's popular in Alaska is birch syrup. Here we have maple syrup. And some of these bottles on the shelves, there's birch syrup, which is treated more like the vinegars that balsamic vinegar is kind of a heavy liquid to put on. If you put it on pancakes, you find it pretty bitter. But if you used it sparingly, like you would a balsamic vinegar, you might enjoy it. But home preservation here was very popular. As we left the fairgrounds, we turned around and headed south towards Seward. And you take the Seward Highway, and there's mileposts on the Seward Highway, and there are tour guides that will say milepost 162, 165, whatever, and it gives you a tourist attraction site to check out, which makes it really interesting. So we drove down to Seward, which takes several hours. And Seward is on Cook Inlet, and there's a Coast Guard base there, and this is a cutter. But behind it is a cruise ship, and it's the only one that we saw on our trip. And there's just hundreds and hundreds of rooms on that ship. And we chose to be minimalist tourists in Alaska by staying in bed and breakfast and renting a car. And so when we got into Seward this particular morning, there were just hundreds and hundreds of people pulling their suitcases into the cruise ship to depart. And we were glad to see them go because the community wasn't that crowded. So this is a shot of downtown Seward. And if you look over the green awning there to the mountain, you see a white line that goes on the right-hand side just below the peak. And here's a different shot, which is a helicopter that is flying on the mountain. So if you look at the below the helicopter, there's kind of a V in the terrain and a white trail. If you follow that up to the right on a diagonal, you see it goes up to the top of the mountain. If I go back a slide, you can see it goes pretty much to the summit. Well, this is called Marathon Mountain. And on the 4th of July every year, there's a marathon foot race up and down the mountain, rain or shine. And let me tell you, you have to be one rugged runner to be able to handle that. I mean, the pitch on that mountain is as nasty as anything we'd see here in the Adirondacks. So it just impressed me to look at it. It's not a feat I would ever consider undertaking. From Seward, in Seward, we walked around, and many of the buildings have these beautiful murals on them. I mean, it's a seacoast town. And if you watch some of the cable channels, you're aware that the Alaska Sea Life Center is in Seward. And so I think some of these murals reflect the fact that there's so much research there and rehabilitation of sea life. Another mural of kayakers in town in front of one of the glaciers, and Alaska has hundreds of glaciers. And then some Inuit art around the corner from the Sea Life Museum. And then also there's advertising here for gold panning, which I'm sure this is seeded with a couple of little nuggets for folks to come in and look for gold. But that was pretty popular advertising in and around Seward. From Seward, we took a boat ride out into Resurrection Bay, and we were heading to Fox Island as a destination. There was a restaurant there. I call it a small convention center, and we went there for some hiking and for a king crab luncheon. And on the way over, there were lots of wildlife for us to see. We had seals, and I'll skip a slide for a second. We had sea lions that were, the boat probably came with 50 feet or more or closer to shore, and they could have cared less about it. They were a little bit curious, but they didn't jump in the water and basically swim away. They just looked at us. But between those two slides, there's this one here. This is my name for this. I call it the Walrus Glacier, the Walrus Tusk Glacier, because that's what those two glacial slides look like to me. I don't know if it has an official name, but for me, that's what I think it looks like. So when we got to Fox Island, we took a boat ride around the whole island. And again, this is subsidence of 10 feet from the earthquake from 1964. And this particular area was pretty much denuded of vegetation. There's some that's coming back, as you can see, but it looked like a desert. It was all rough rock, low grasses and mosses, and not much else. And it went on for, I think, a couple of miles. So we left Seward, and we're heading now. When you leave Seward to get to Homer, you have to go back north. When you see the map there, the road goes due west, and then it goes down to the southwest. And the whole area below Anchorage that we're on is the Kenai Peninsula. And so we're on the Kenai, and which is a beautiful, beautiful place. And there's parts of it that I'm not showing because of the time constraints we have for tonight. But there's a Copper River area. And if you're a salmon fisherman who likes to be in a boat and have a real challenge, we watch some pretty incredible people fish for salmon. So now we're headed to Homer. On the way down, we pass this Russian Orthodox church, and it's in Nilchik, this small little town on the western shore of the Kenai Peninsula, and it has this beautiful Orthodox domes on it, these small domes in the cemetery. It's really a lovely place to visit. And then adjacent to it is the fishing village of Nilchik, and it looked like a hard-scrabble place to live. And if you look across from it, you'll see a volcano that we'll talk about in a minute. I believe it's the Redoubt volcano. And this here, again, as we're on the Kenai, we're coming into the exit glacier, like the exit sign on the exit glacier. And for those of you that know Adirondack wildflowers, those white little puffs on the stalks in front of us are the remains of fireweed. And fireweed is ubiquitous in Alaska. And we were there as it had matured out, and this was in the middle of August. But virtually everywhere you go in Alaska, you see fireweed, and we have some of it here in the Adirondack Park. So the exit glacier, it's accessible from the road, and you park your car and you walk down a path, and there's the glacier right in front of you. It's been receding for decades, and there are signposts in the parking lot that start in the parking lot and take you all the way to the mouth of the glacier, and it marks the recession of it, which is more than a mile in the last 100 years. The glacier is just disappearing. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you see kind of that oval hole there that's dark. That's the mouth of the glacier with water absolutely pouring out of it, just gushing out of the glacier. This is the terminus of the glacier. And here to give you some scale of it are some people. It was really noisy as the glacier's melting. And the water's coming out, and it's pushing out all kinds of rocks as it melts, and it's just this big loud rumble. And the rocks that these people are standing on used to be under ice, and they're glaciated, and there's striation marks on them that you can see. There's deep enough for you to put your fingernails in them. It was a really interesting place to visit. So now we're in Homer. We're in the harbor at Homer, and it's just a beautiful place filled with tons and tons and hundreds of fishing boats and pleasure boats. And the Alaska weather was excellent while we were there. And if you look in the far part of the screen there, you can see a white tower with these white circular rings on it. And just to the left of center of the tallest sailboat mast, that is a tsunami warning siren tower, which, tsunamis hit this part of the world. So there's a warning center there. And then behind it, if you look at that bluff, that's a 600-foot high bluff, which is it represents the main part of Homer. Homer, where we're now looking at these boats, is on the Homer Spit, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's a small spit of land with an elevation change of probably 15 or 20 inches above the water line. But up on that ridge is 600 feet, and that's where we stayed in a bed and breakfast up there, oddly enough called the Aloha Inn in Alaska. And this is the harbor again, but look at the elevation change in the water with the tidal change, and see the marks on the post over by the gantry there. It's just, we were there on days when it was basically parallel to the water, on days like this where the tide was way out. So the tidal change was significant. Homer's known for its halibut. It's the halibut capital of Alaska. And these little halibut representation flags were common around town. And being that it's a harbor and a seafarer's port, there's this beautiful memorial to seafarers who had lost their lives. And since I took this picture, I believe there's been 2 more names added to the memorial plaques in the building. And this gentleman here represents seafarers, male and female. And there's this beautiful weather vane of a whale and her calf on top of it with a fish scale roof, or simulation of a fish scale roof that was made of copper. As I mentioned a moment ago, the bluff here, the spit, the Homer Spit, goes out into the water. It's approximately 4.5 miles long. It's barely above sea level, and a tsunami would take it out in a heartbeat, or extraordinary, even a rogue wave would. And I'm on the bluff above it at our bed and breakfast. We're looking down at it, but if you look at the cloud formation in the sky, you can see it mimics the shape of the spit. The spit has a little bit of a claw shape to it, kind of like Long Island does, if you look at Long Island from above. And so if you look at that, that's a daytime shot of it. And I happened to be there during a full moon, and my goal was to catch the spit lit up at night, but I didn't know it was going to be the full moon to that night. So it was kind of fun to catch it. I mean, you've got the spit, you've got a glacier across the way, there's a volcano way off in the distance that we can't see. It was like everything you'd want to see in Alaska. And you have fireweed blooming in the foreground. And then for me, I'm a bit of a birder. While I was standing there composing those earlier pictures, I kept hearing the call of sandhill cranes, which I've only heard maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. And they kept coming closer and closer, and I was able to catch some of them in the air as the sun was setting. And they spent the night in a bay below our bed and breakfast down along the shore, and we could hear them calling all night long, which I thought was pretty cool. So Homer Spit is kind of funky. For those of you who've been to Cape Cod out, towards Provincetown, they have all these kitschy tourist attractions. Well, Homer is filled with them, but some of them have some really nice merchandise, and others not so much. There's a couple good T-shirt shops there and some great food, but the buildings, they pull the tourists in right and left, and so, bicycle rentals, which are popular, riding up and down the Spit and riding on the beaches, although they weren't expansive beaches like you might have here in terms of the width of them. Homer, for some of the broadcasts of the TV program, the Deadliest Catch, the ships were based here, and this is one of them. There were a pair of them going out to sea one of the days I was there, and that's one that's leaving the harbor, which I thought was a pretty cool looking ship. So while we were in Homer, we were taking a ride out to Halibut Cove. On our way to Halibut Cove, we're on this small boat. There's about 8 of us on this boat. It's a tiny little, I'll call it a tugboat. I don't know how else to describe it. And there was 4 of us in the back of the boat, by the stern, and 4 in the front. I was in the back with this great big square little cabin between myself and the front of the boat. And I couldn't see anything going forward. And the people are cheering and clapping in the front about the whales breaching. Okay, I've never seen a whale breach before. So I got to see the whale slapping the water. These are humpback whales. And it was still kind of fun to see them come down into the water just before they hit the water, and to experience them blowing out of their spouts. And whales have bad breath. I can say that because they have a very fishy emission. So that was kind of cool to experience that. There were 3 whales that were breaching and entertaining us. As we headed over to Halibut Cove, we came across some otters, and I'd never seen a sea otter before outside of an aquarium, and I couldn't understand what those big brown things were in front of their faces, and I realized it was their webbed feet that propels them in the water. And they were cute. Yeah, I'll give them that. They get a cute factor. This is a tufted puffin, and to me, it's like his feathers have blown off his head and kind of settled on his shoulders, or he's got a loose toupee on. But he's a pretty handsome bird as they go, as far as I'm concerned. He was kind of cool. And as we headed into Halibut Cove, there was another sea arch, and these were fairly common. We saw multiples of them as we were on our different boat rides. And just an impressive piece of architecture created by Mother Nature. We're coming into Halibut Cove, and the entire community on the island, it's a small island, it's elevated. It's all up on these walkways. And in front of us there is the only sit-down restaurant where you can eat, and it's a very popular place to have lunch. So you come off the boat, you walk straight into it, and they serve a fine meal there. Buried behind the pillars there was this young fellow that we ended up chatting with, who was from the southern townships the eastern townships south of Montreal City, who comes down to the high peaks to hikes all the time. So it was kind of fun to run into an Adirondack hiker out in the middle of Alaska on a boat ride. So there was a small little coffee house here, and Alaska's a place to come and relax. That fellow there in the ball cap and the blue jacket with the backpack by his feet, turns out he's a CFO for a telecommunications company. And I have to believe that he lived a really frenetic life. Right here, he was like melting into the chair, and he hadn't even had coffee yet. So I think Alaska was suiting him well. And again, you can see the paths around the walkway that leads you all around the elevations of Halibut Cove. I did kind of cut away from the group, and I went up, I climbed the highest point on the island. And there's this overlook here with the gazebo, which is a popular place for weddings and celebrations. And it was a really beautiful place to view Resurrection Bay from the top of Halibut Cove. So back in Homer, back at Bushwhackers, where I'll use their logo here, where we pack them, we rack them, we whack them, and we sack them. They will take your catch for you, and they will process it. And these are hands of Eddie, the famous fish filleter, who liked to have his picture taken, and he could fillet your fish, in under a minute. It basically was cleaned in some kind of container for you to take home. So we saw countless people come in off boats and get their fish filleted and packaged up to take home. And these were 3 very proud fisher people. So my second trip to Alaska, I wanted to go to see the grizzly bears. On my first trip, we stayed at a bed and breakfast in Homer, and the woman who owned it turned out to be the former president of the Homer Chamber of Commerce, and she knew everybody and everything about Homer. And at breakfast one morning, we were chatting, and I told her about wanting to photograph grizzly bears. And she said, well, you need to contact this fellow whose name I don't recall, from Adirondack Ultimate Safaris. I do remember, though, he's from Minneapolis. He and his wife came down from Minnesota to get away from winter. So they moved to Alaska. Okay, I scratched my head about that. But when you're in northern northern part of Alaska up in Fairbanks, they refer to Homer as the Banana Republic because in the wintertime, Homer is relatively warm because of the ocean currents, where it might be 22 degrees here, but up in Fairbanks, it's 25 or 30 below zero for weeks on end. So Homer is their Banana Republic. Well, this fellow was terrific. The helicopter seats 5 people. Pilot makes 6. And so when I told Pat at the bed and breakfast that I wanted to photograph grizzly bears, I was pretty excited, but in that trip, my first trip, we didn't have time to do it. So second trip, it was my sole focus. We got off the plane in Anchorage, we drove to Homer, 2:00 that afternoon, I was on a plane flying to Lake Clark National Park. And it's one of the least visited parks in the United States, one of the national parks. And if you look straight below it, you see Kodiak Island. So in the morning, the pilot goes out of Homer, this chopper, and he surveys both Kodiak Island and the bay where we were in Lake Clark National Park to see what grizzly bears are out feeding so you can go photograph them. Well, that day there was nothing on Kodiak Island, and he takes 2 flights a day with paying customers. And the first flight, they saw 0 bears. On our flight, we saw lots of bears. But to get there, you've got to fly over a volcano. And this volcano is west-northwest of Homer, and it's called Chinetna Volcano. And the bears are in the waters of the glacier that's melting, which is the left-hand side of the screen, that the glacier waters melt down and flow out through a sedge meadow into Cook Inlet. So as we flew over the volcano, he kind of banked the helicopter so we could see better out of one side of it. I swear that the struts were going to touch the ground. We were so close. But there were pyroclastic flows from the last eruption, and I don't know when that was, and there were glaciers, and it was just a really neat experience. So you go from there, and you start flying over this sedge meadow, not a grass, but a sedge, and you see these deep tracks in the grasses, or excuse me, in the sedges, and this green turf. And then you start to see bears. And they start appearing, and they come up out of the hills, mostly alone or mothers with their cubs. And then when the helicopter lands, and you walk from the helicopter, which is maybe 40 feet from the edge of the water, you go through some mud flats, you start seeing these footprints. So that footprint from the big toe on the top to the little toe on the bottom is about 10 inches across. It's a massive footprint of a grizzly bear. And then we started to see the bears. And at any one time, we had no fewer than 9 grizzly bears in our field of vision. We were there for 6.5 hours, standing on the floodplain from the glacier on the edge of the sedge meadows in the mud flats with waders on, watching the bears feed on salmon. And it was an easy catch for most of them. If a bear didn't get a fish in about 2 to 3 minutes from when they kind of got a bead on one, they weren't a good hunter at all. I mean, none of these bears were starving, and they were chubby bears. So if you just look at the color, I'll go back a slide. If you look at the color of these bears and this bear, you'll see the color variations. And this is mom and one of her cubs, and she's honey colored on top, and her little guy there is kind of chocolate colored. And we saw those variations all through our time there on the edge of the water. So as the bears are chewing on a fresh salmon, and sushi's not any fresher than that, it's probably been dead for 1.5 minutes, and the bears are devouring it. The seagulls are there driving the bears nuts, and the bear would be running after them and barking at them and howling and growling. It was kind of fun, and the fleagulls would just like, yeah, whatever, and they'd come back and trying to get the scraps of food. So the Alaska Ultimate Safari advertises, we take you to the bears, but in this picture, I add to that, and we bring the bears to you. But look, he's directly behind our helicopter. I should say she, because that's the same bear. Check out her belly. This is August. It's a gravid female, and the bears give birth up in their dens, high on the ridges, at least 1,500 feet above the water. so that their dens are protected from predators. So this is August. She's due to give birth in February or March. So we got to believe she's got twins and, you know, maybe, I don't know, 8 cubs. I mean, she just looks like a big bear. She was. And this is another bear, and check out the coloration of him, kind of the two tones. He was sitting down in the water and just kind of wetting his backside and looking at us, and maybe that's why he's a couple colors. Most of them needed to go to the car wash. They were kind of dirty from being up in the hills, I think. This is the only bear of the dozens and dozens of bears that we saw that made eye contact with us. They all virtually ignored us. This one made eye contact with my lens. And if you know anything about wild animals, you don't want to make eye contact with predators like this because they take it as a threat. Now, he's several hundred feet from me. I'm using a lens that, you know, a 600 or 700 millimeter lens at this point. So I'm not exactly close to him, but he looked at me. I'm like, oh boy, this isn't good. And these are some geese that flew over that I had never seen before. They're greater white-fronted geese, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them in the small ponds that were on the edge of the glacial outflow. They were pretty birds with a nice song, and it's just a small part of the flock that came through. Here, we're heading back north. We're again on the west side of the Kenai Peninsula, and that's the Mount Redoubt volcano. And I think I almost wrecked the car when we came around a corner and there's a snow-covered volcano in front of me. I hadn't anticipated that in Alaska. I knew there were volcanoes, but I didn't know they'd be in our field of vision like this. It was just remarkable to see one. And they're pretty scenic for a photographer who likes to take pictures. They're pretty. And then there's always somebody who gets a good phrase out of a Mount Redoubt, kicks ash, you know, for a bumper sticker, which I just thought was fun, and this old beat up car. And this, I believe, is the Mount Spur volcano. I'm not certain, but I think it is. And there's a glacier on each side of it. That part I do know. And this is just a fun picture. It's the license plate house. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, you can see a man by the tow truck. And I was in the rear passenger seat with my camera crouching down low to shoot this out the car window because I just thought it was so unique. There's hundreds of license plates that surround the 4 sides of this house. I'm assuming that he might have collected them from the jobs that he had of cars that might have been junked or something, but there they are, providing insulation to his house for the wintertime. And this is just a scenic shot. We stayed at a bed and breakfast called Turn Lake. And you can't go more than, I don't know, a half a mile in Alaska or a mile without some scenic vista to take a look at, some body of water, some mountains, some avalanche slide that occurred in the wintertime. There's this raw scar down the side of a mountain. Alaska's just a beautiful place. It's really stunning. Heading back towards Anchorage, we stopped at the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, and sometimes this is profiled on Discovery Channel programs, and this is a rehab center for Alaskan wildlife. And this is the skinniest moose I've ever seen in my life. I haven't seen many, but that's why he was there, to get fattened up. And he was eating a whole lot of willow that day, and he needed to. But we also got to see, this is the first grizzly bear I saw in 2016 when I was in the protected habitat. We're standing on a platform about 8 feet or so above the grizzly bear, so it looks like we're incredibly close. We are, but we're safe. And I have to say, they're impressive, really impressive when you're that close. When he lifts his leg up and you see the length of the claws on his paw, it's just remarkable. There were elk there in the conservation center, a small black bear that looked smaller than our bears here. Maybe it was immature, although with the white on the muzzle, it just wasn't a very big bear, maybe in comparison to a grizzly. There was an Arctic wolf. I'd seen some wolves up in Greenland, north of Greenland years ago, and this guy looks pretty scrawny to me compared to the ones I saw, which had their full winter coats on and they were snow white, but still a very handsome animal, and I wouldn't want to tangle with them. And as we left there, we were heading up north towards Talkeetna, so that we could take a plane flight over Denali Mount Denali, Mount McKinley. And there were three of us that were in the car, and two of us went in the plane. My friend Jim, he just locked his feet and said, "There's no way I'm getting in that plane." So Patty and I had a time of our lives going to Talkeetna. And Talkeetna is a tourist town, and it's one of the places you can see Mount McKinley. And in Alaska, you can buy a T-shirt that says, "I'm part of the 30% club." You only have a 30% chance of seeing Mount McKinley without clouds. So on my trips to Alaska, I saw it essentially every time I had an opportunity. So this is Talkeetna, the Mount McKinley Express Railroad car there that came up from Seward and all the way north, almost to Fairbanks, and a beautiful shot of the mountain. Very exciting to see at that time. And then another shot in a different part of the valley of McKinley, again without clouds, just remarkable. It's just exciting to see it. And like Homer, Talkeetna is a little tourist place, and it's got these funky buildings which are fun to go into, which some of them have some beautiful souvenirs, some Inuit carvings and jewelry to purchase, which I've been known to bring back from Alaska. It's just a really lovely place. And here's where we took our flights. This is our pilot, and he's an ex-military pilot. So I had lots of confidence in him flying around the mountains. And he lives year-round in Los Angeles, and he flies helicopters in LA. But for a few weeks in the summertime, he comes to Alaska for sightseeing tours through over Denali. So here we're flying up to the top of the mountain, which is 20,300 feet plus, and we're going to land on a glacier just below the summit. So I actually got to be in the cockpit as a co-pilot, in the co-pilot seat on the way up, and at these shots of this glacier, which I believe runs for at least 40 miles, and these are just some of the curves. For those of you who are photographers, I had a 14 millimeter lens on my camera, which is about as wide as you can get before you have a fisheye. I couldn't capture how wide this glacier was, but it was just really beautiful. This glacial outflow. It was a river of ice. And then we're flying through the mountains, and I'm shooting these pictures, and I'm thinking all the rock climbers that I know back here in the Adirondacks should probably go nuts having a chance to climb these hills, or some of the heli skiers. Could you imagine being let off on the top of that cliff with your skis and going for a run? I can't, but some of you might, I'm not sure. This here was the spookiest part of the flight in. I'm in the co-pilot seat, and it looked like the tips of the plane were going to touch the cliffs on each side. It's actually 1.5 miles wide, but it doesn't look it when you're flying through it. And again, in front of us is a river of ice that's coming down off the top of the mountain, heading out to the lower part of Alaska. And here we are on the glacier below the summit. This is the plane. You can see the skis that the plane has on that drop down. The young fellow there in the picture is from Argentina, and he asked me if I would take his picture. And I'm like, sure, I'll be glad to take your picture. So he handed me his iPhone, and he walked out into the sunshine, and we turned around and had him facing the plane. He started jumping up and down and shaking his arms, and he was just so excited. I don't know if I got him in a blurry picture or a focused one, but he had a really good time. And in turn, he took my picture on the glacier, which is one of my favorite souvenirs of the trips. So Denali, again, this is the shots previous to the mountain I took in Talkeetna. Now, on my second trip to Alaska, we were coming from Anchorage to Fairbanks, which was a long, long ride on some terrible roads. And we stopped for a snack and a water break, and I looked around in these tall spruce trees in the mountains. It was kind of pretty. And all of a sudden I saw this break of white, and I thought it was just some clouds. Then I saw more white. Then I realized we were looking at the Denali Range again. And if you see those gray clouds to the right side of the picture, they blew away. We had about 10 minutes of visibility, and the cars were screeching to a halt as they were coming to this little pull-off on the side of the road to get pictures of Denali, because again, you've only got a 30% chance of seeing it without clouds covering the mountain. So it was again, just a super opportunity for us to get a look at it. 20,000 feet, it's impressive. So that brings us to the end of our trip to the last frontier. And I always end it with the grizzly bears because I just think they're just beautiful animals and this is their habitat. And Mom here was teaching her cubs to hunt. And these two cubs, they had some success and they had a lot of failures, but it was fun to see Mom nurturing them through their growth as independent hunters. So thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you for letting me share my photographs of Alaska, the last frontier.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. And at this point, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. And again, if you choose that they go to all attendees, also everyone else will see your question as well. Oh, we have a thank you from Mom. I'm not sure if that's your mom, but.
I'll take it. Thank you.
Another emoji, ma'am. Thank you. Okay. Anne, do you want to read the rest of the questions?
You know what, Chris, you just go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. So the next question, and I'm trying to see who it's from, Pat says, how close to the bears were you?
Well, when the bear walked behind the helicopter, we were probably about 20 feet from the bear. But most of the bears were anywhere from 50 feet to several hundred feet in front of us out in the shallow waters of Cook Inlet. We never felt in danger because the bears were so preoccupied with the salmon, they could have cared less about us. And the helicopters come virtually every day to observe the bear. So they're used to having people around and we're really not threats. And being that it's a national park, I don't believe there's any hunting there. I'm not certain about that, but I don't think so.
So the pilot didn't have a gun or anything in case they charged you?
He did, yes.
Oh, he did? Oh.
Yes.
Gretchen says, thank you, beautiful pictures.
Thank you.
Right then, it looks to be the last of our questions. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you everyone for coming on this snowy night, which got us in the mood. Oh, here's one that says from Ilian, wonderful. I have sandhill cranes living here with me in the Berkshires. Thank you so much.
Oh, exciting.
Oh, and here's another question from Mom. What was the temperature?
I was there both times in the month of August, and the temperature was in the 60s. It was very comfortable. The temperature would drop to the high 40s to the low 50s in the mornings, so it was no complaints about the weather. We were never really hot.
Sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And Todd and Rosemary say, great program.
Thank you.
All right, then. I guess that's a wrap. So we'll see you at the next Adirondack Mountain Club program in May. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.